On behalf of my co-author, Larry Sturdivant, and myself, I wish to thank the organizers of the conference for accepting our abstract on neutron activation and allowing us to present what we believe is a very strong story on some important physical evidence, which Larry routinely refers to as the queen of the physical evidence in this case. The neutron activation data are not known particularly well, and we feel it is important to bring this before the interested researchers, and that's what I am going to try to do today. This talk has 5 parts. I will do my best to get through them all in the time allotted. Ben will check me if I can't. Oh, by the way, Larry Sturdivant wanted very much to be here, but he's just returned from about 5.5 weeks of a road trip with his family, lives in Santa Fe, and cannot bring himself to come. It's just a little bit too much. He wants to stay home after 5.5 weeks, and I don't blame him. The 5 parts to this talk are the setting, the neutron activation and the results, the significance, some potential problems and answers, and some conclusions. The setting, I have changed this talk a little bit at the last minute. The setting is an extended setting. It's a description it's an extended version of an op-ed article that I and 9 others had published a week ago today, last Sunday, in the Austin Statesman in their print version, and on their website it was accompanied by a very strongly worded a story by one of their reporters. I don't know if it's still up on the website, www.statesman.com. Probably not up there anymore, but I have made some copies of that. I brought in approximately 50, and I've put them over here if you wish to take a look at that. It is called Chance, Not Conspiracy in the Death of JFK. So let us move forward. The setting. No conspiracy possible. By the way, I'm going to say a lot of things that are very different from other speakers in this conference. That was encouraged by Ben Wecht. So here we go. Other speakers have asked you to stand up and stretch. I'm going to ask you to do the mental equivalent, to clear your mind, stretch it, and make it open for the story that I have to tell you today. The setting. Everything has a setting. Everything has a background. In this case, no conspiracy possible, precluded by the chance nature of events. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I want to reserve enough time for the neutron activation part, but the setting is extremely important here. 4 parallel strands of chance brought Oswald Kennedy and Ruby Oswald together. 2, Oswald coming to Kennedy, Kennedy coming to Oswald, and then Ruby coming to Oswald, and Oswald coming to Ruby. Strand 1, Oswald to Kennedy. October 3rd, 1963, Oswald arrives in Dallas from Mexico, badly needing work, just when the Texas School Book Depository was hiring seasonal workers. October 4th, applies for a job with Paget Corporation, declined because of bad recommendation from previous job. October 14th, Ruth Payne, with whom Oswald's wife was living in Irving, learns from neighbor Linnie Mae Randall that the School Book Depository is hiring, arranges an interview. 15th, Oswald interviews. 16th, begins work. October 20th, Oswald bears second child. Why are these dates important? Because it all happened long before a motorcade was even planned for Dallas. It is often forgotten that the original plans for the trip to Texas included other motorcades, but not one in Dallas. The trip to Texas was announced on the 24th of September, but with no motorcade for Dallas. The motorcade was added between the 28th of October and the 18th of November, 2 to 5 weeks after Oswald started at the depository. The final route was decided on November 18th, first announced in the papers November 19th. The first map of the route, which drew the attention of Oswald and other workers in the depository, was published on the 21st. That gave the putative conspirators only 3 days to plan, and the evidence is that Oswald himself made up his mind only 1 day before. That's Thursday morning, when he and the other workers in the depository first saw the map in the early edition of the morning's newspaper. Big conspiracies don't operate on 3-day timelines. Nimble individuals can take advantage of that opportunity. Strand 2, Kennedy to Oswald. This follows something that James Reston Jr. calls the three furies. I'm indebted to him and to my colleague Joel Grant for distilling this information. First fury. Texas Christian University cancels an honorary degree. This was a degree that was arranged by John Connally. As you all know, John Kennedy was a Catholic. Texas Christian University is a Protestant organization. They thought they had it arranged. It was canceled at the last minute. That created dead time on Friday morning. The entourage was originally to fly into Fort Worth on Friday morning. They decided to fill the time with a breakfast event that required them to fly Thursday night rather than Friday morning. The breakfast event still left a couple of hours open. John Kennedy loved motorcades. He wanted a motorcade, second fury. This was the 7th motorcade of the trip. Connally opposed the motorcade, said it would make Kennedy too tired at the luncheon and it wouldn't raise enough money for the Democratic Party. Kennedy and his advisors won the battle, but, and we come to the third fury, the route of the motorcade depended on the location of the luncheon. Kennedy and the Secret Service wanted the Women's Building in downtown Dallas, near downtown Dallas. That would require the motorcade to cross Dealey Plaza and the main street in the middle, going in the opposite direction, 40 miles an hour, slowing down only when they reached Houston. It would have been much farther from the depository, moving faster, and the opposite direction would have, among other things, put Mrs. Kennedy between the shooter and her husband. But John Connally insisted on the Trade Mart for political reasons, which I don't have time to go into now, and the rest is history. Strand 3, Ruby to Oswald. Ruby's Sunday morning timeline needs to be looked at in a little detail. Because remember, in boldface we see here, Oswald was scheduled to be transferred from the city jail to the county jail at 10 o'clock in the morning. Ruby, the alleged conspirator, was still sleeping until 9 to 9:30 that morning. Gets up somewhere along in there. 10:19, 19 minutes after the transfer was scheduled, receives a second phone call, the first one being the previous day, from dancer Karen Carlin in one of his clubs requesting $25, tells her he is going downtown to his club and will send it from there. 10:20, he begins to take 30 to 40 minutes to bathe, shower, dress. 11 o'clock approximately, as well as can be reconstructed, leaves for the Western Union office, takes a revolver, a radio, and his favorite dog, Sheba. That's what I call the Sheba factor. Dog lovers, would you take your favorite dog with you, leave her in the car if you knew you were not coming back? The answer is obvious to everybody. 11 to 11:15, takes a route deliberately through Dealey Plaza, notes the mourners, the flowers, etc., and that route takes him past the police station in order to get to the Western Union. Notes that there's a small crowd outside. 11:15, these are all approximate, parks at Western Union, leaves keys, billfold, $1,000 in trunk. 40 years ago, folks, think what $1,000 was right then. Puts key in glove compartment and leaves car unlocked. With 11:15, with revolver and $2,000 cash, enters the Western Union office, fills out forms to wire $25 to Carlin, waits patiently in line. Why the $2,000? Why the revolver? He lived on a cash economy from his clubs. Okay, he had $2,000 on his person. Think what that was 40 years ago. Right? He had $1,000 in his trunk. He kept his revolver with him, not because he was going to shoot somebody, but protect the cash that he carried with him at all times. 11:17, gets a time-stamped receipt, walks back half a block to the police office, enters the basement, some uncertainty as to how he entered, but probably through the ramp that was left briefly unguarded. 1 minute later, about, down comes Oswald. Ruby lunges, shoots him once in the abdomen. No conspiracy here, no possible. The guy is practically sleeping at the time that he was to be transferred. Okay? I think this invalidates the single biggest argument for conspiracy. Strand 4, Oswald to Ruby. We know a little bit more about this, but I want to point it out just for the record. Chief Postal Inspector Harry Holmes decided at the last minute to skip church and question Oswald further. That started about 10 o'clock in the morning and it ended about 11 o'clock. Took roughly an extra hour, delayed the transfer Just imagine the timelines of Ruby and Oswald going together here. That took about an hour. Then Oswald, a little bit vain, requested to change to do a dark sweater for TV. He knew he was going to be photographed during the transfer. That took an additional 10 minutes. Without the questioning or the transfer, Ruby would have arrived too late. Both these strands are necessary. To review the 4 strands of chance: 1, Oswald to the book depository, and Kennedy through the neighbor's brother. 2, Kennedy to Oswald, 3 Furies. 3, Oswald to Ruby, 2 delays. 4, Ruby to Oswald, $25 for the dancer. The 4 strands of chance clear, in my opinion, Oswald and Ruby of conspiracy. Next, could it be possible that there was no conspiracy at all that day? If so, we can make in the scientific deductive mode 2 predictions. Number 1, all evidence advanced for conspiracy will fail. Number 2, conspiracy theories, for those who choose to push them anyhow, will be all over the map because they're ungrounded. Okay? All major evidence for conspiracy does indeed fail. Please excuse me, I'm going to go rather rapidly over these points. They're setting the background. I wish to address very briefly the rearward lurch in the Zapruder film, the magic bullet, the acoustics, and the shooter on the knoll. I will be happy to discuss these things afterwards in more detail with anyone who's interested. Rearward lurch, back and to the rear, was the second movement, not the first. The first movement was a quick snap forward, too quick to be seen in real time. Here is you can see the first movement between 3:12 and 3:13, 2.2 inches forward, about 3 feet per second. That's the movement that shows the direction the bullet came from. It came from the rear, not from the front. Then that is followed by a long accelerating rearward movement stretched over 7 frames. That starts too late and accelerates too long to be from a bullet. Okay? Magic bullet. A brief presentation, partial presentation on this. Not only could have passed through both men, penetrating power and proper alignment, but was damaged consistent with having done so. Here's the alignment from above, the horizontal alignment. Here's the vertical alignment of the 2 men. It is entirely possible, cannot be excluded. They line up almost perfectly. Here's the line of damage through the neck. Here's the way, regrettably, this whole thing is distorted by the critics, and I say with a certain degree of sadness that a diagram like this was on the website for this conference. The pristine bullet, when you look at it this way, it looks pretty good. When you look at it this way, it is anything but. Vice-like forces had to deform this end. Okay? Can that bullet pass through 2 men? Of course it can. It can pass through 4 feet of pine and can kill elephants. It was used for 50 years routinely in Africa before the assassination for hunting elephants. Folks, if it can hunt an elephant, it can pass through 2 men, especially when the first passage doesn't hit anything, doesn't hit any bone. Here's a diagram from John Latimer's book of a Mannlicher-Carcano bullet passing through 47 inches of pine, 4 feet, without deforming. You can see the actual bullet down below. HSCA and acoustics. I'll be very brief. You have heard this story in much more detail yesterday. They claimed that the shots had been recorded from the police radio, that a microphone was stuck open in Dooley Plaza. The acoustic experts found 4 shots. We heard 5 yesterday or the day before, 1 or 2 from the knoll. Chairman rammed it through at the 11th hour, declared high probability of 95% of conspiracy. But there were a couple of problems with this. Number 1, they got the wrong motorcycle. The single most important thing to know about the acoustics was that motorcycle was a 3-wheeler out by the Trade Mart somewhere. The Dallas police had this nailed from the beginning. They know who it was, why he was out there, and so on. Furthermore, they didn't check anywhere else on the tape. They did not do a control experiment, as is required in all scientific experiments. Dallas police knew all along whose motorcycle it was. Acoustics fails. Next, shooter on the knoll. There's pros and cons here. If you go to the knoll and look, you will see that it's very close. Here's a couple pictures I took 2 years ago down there. Behind one part of the picket fence, behind the other part of the picket fence. There's no way that there could have been a shooter with a rifle there and not knocked the heads off of the other people practically. That would have been so obvious. The same closeness that makes a good shot also makes the shooter obvious, and no shooter was detected there, no physical trace was left, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The badge man, do you really think that's a person back there? The North Knoll sniper, do you really think that's somebody back there? No, it didn't happen. No. The shooter on the knoll fails as evidence for conspiracy. All major evidence has failed. First prediction of non-conspiracy has been validated. Second prediction, all conspiracy theories, scenarios will be all over the place. Let's just tick off some of these things, and we won't go into great detail. How many theories would you like? At least 100 by my count. Nearly every writer proposes a different theory. You can find almost anything in them you would like. How many shots would you like? You can read these for yourself. These are all the different ones that have been proposed. How many gunmen would you like? This is the gunmen front and rear that have been proposed. Almost any combination you would like is out there. Which shooters would you like? We don't have to read them all off. You know these probably as well as I do. The list goes on and on and on. My favorite is James Files. My second favorite is Greer the driver. Elbow to elbow at Dealey Plaza. At least 67 conspirators so far have been identified as being in or very near Dealey Plaza, leaving hardly room for anybody else. Which instigators would you like? You can name them. My favorite one of all these things is the educational establishment and the Catholic school hierarchy. It's ludicrous, folks. Right? Which weapons and projectiles would you like? Rifles, pistols, AR-15 of Secret Service, regular bullets, frangible bullets, ice bullets, poison darts shot through umbrellas. Take your pick. It's all out there. Where would you like them to shoot from? The depository, the Daltex building, the knoll, the railroad overpass, the roofs of at least 2 buildings, the storm drain, the trees, in little pods up in the little trees, a helicopter, a curb, the presidential limousine. How would you like them to work? Independently, under radio control, single shooters teams. And the real story is Superman looking at Lois Lane. I thought you might be interested in learning I knew you killed Jack Kennedy. Lois Lane says, properly so, what kind of nut are you anyway? Get out of here before I call the manager. Why so many theories? Now we get serious again. Why are the theories all over the map? Because there's no definitive evidence for any of them. Everybody is guessing differently. Does it bother anybody in the crowd that nobody at this conference have given you any solid idea of what actually happened that day or who actually did it? Conspiracy theories are all over the place. Evidence for conspiracy fails. All right? The setting for the NAA to repeat is no conspiracy. All right. If there were no conspiracy, then we can predict how the neutron activation bullet evidence ought to come out. It must be consistent, should be consistent with a single shooter, and that's exactly what we see. And now we move into the heart of the talk, the neutron activation. We all know the 5 sets of fragments that were recovered, Q1, that had lead associated with them, Q1, Q2, Q4, 5, Q9, Q14. There were 2 large portions of bullets and 3 sets of smaller fragments. Here's the locations where they were recovered from. President's brain, Q4-5, John Connally's arm, Q9, the stretcher bullet that came from the thigh, infamous CE-399, Q1, rear carpet underneath Mrs. Connally's seat, Q14, and the front seat, the other large fragment, Q2. The analyses. The goal of the neutron activation analysis was very simple and very narrow. This is a paraphrase of the words of Hoover, to try to determine how many bullets hit the men by associating the little fragments with the larger engraved fragments. That had also been the goal of the previous spectrographic analysis on the night of the assassination, but it failed. The answer in advance, by the way, is positive evidence for 2 and only 2 bullets, both fired from Oswald's rifle. This is one of the strongest results from any of the physical evidence. A related goal for the neutron activation work is to evaluate the possibility of an accidental chemical match from another bullet, either from another shooter or from a planted bullet or fragment. And the clear answer I will show you is it did not happen. There were 2 sets of neutron activation analyses, one in May 1964 for the Warren Commission, undertaken by the FBI. It was kept secret. as was the spectroscopic data, contained multiple systematic errors. That was probably the reason it was kept secret. 13 years later, in 1977, Vincent Gwynne, professor at the University of California, Irvine, reanalyzed the samples. This was highly publicized for the HSCA, showed two clear groups of fragments, agreed with the FBI analyses. Now we go on to the results. I could show these to you in tabular form, and they're not going to mean a whole lot. I'm going to show them to you in graphical form in just a second, but here's the FBI's results for silver and antimony. Antimony is the prime tracer element in Mannlicher Carcano bullets because it varies so much, because they were made from a mixture of virgin lead and scrap lead, some of which had recycled lead, some of which had been from hardened bullets, and some of which not. If you look at the data on silver in the first column, you will see that the Q1 and Q9 have somewhat high values in the 9s parts per million, and then you see the other three fragments are somewhere around 8. That's not a very large variation. That does not give silver as much tracer power as it gives antimony. If you look at the 4 runs for antimony, you will see that they differ from one another, but if you look down the column, you will see that the first 2 fragments have high values. And consider run 1, for example, 950 parts per million approximately for antimony. And then you will see the other 3 fragments are about 200 parts per million lower. And if you look down the other 3 columns, you'll see exactly the same trend. A high group and a low group about 200 parts per million lower. Right? This is some kind of systematic error. Nobody knows exactly what it was that entered the FBI's runs. Here's Gwynne's results. You'll see they are qualitatively very similar. A high group for silver, the first 2 fragments, and a somewhat lower group, a high group for antimony, the first 2 fragments, and 200 parts per million lower for the third group. All right, we just said this. Antimony is more informative, and that's what we'll focus on for the rest of this. Very important point. 2 separate analyses, 13 years apart, and the FBI and Gwynne found the same 2 groups. Here's the graphical presentation of these 2 things. Gwynne's data, this is concentration of antimony on the vertical axis versus the fragment on the horizontal axis. You will see that Gwynne's data are the large black squares. They overlap almost perfectly with one of the 4 FBI's runs. I believe it was run number 3. Okay. No matter which of these groups from the FBI you take, you will see that there's a high group and there's a low group. The question par excellence here is, are these 2 groups distinct? And this is a no-brainer, basically. You can just look at the data and you can see how distinct they are. But people who like statistics will show you some statistics. I have 4 ways of evaluating the distinctness of these groups in increasing order of complexity. 1, just look at the samples. 2, look at the means and standard deviations. 3, test statistically the differences of the means. And 4, use general linear model analyses. This is one of Larry Sturtevant's very many contributions to this talk. Larry has a master's in statistics and has a good head about him for this stuff. I owe a lot of this presentation to Larry. Look at the individual samples. Here they are. This is from Gwynne's data. These have 3% uncertainties associated with them. See how obvious the upper group is and how clearly it's separated from the lower group. Examine the means of the groups. Now we put these, here's the means of the groups now on a log scale, and I'll tell you in just a moment why we use the log scale. Turns out because they're distributed logarithmically. Here's the 2 groups, the means and the standard deviation. See how distinct they are. Blow it up a little bit, go run the range from 6 to 7 only, and you see the means are 6 standard deviations apart. No way do they overlap. You don't need any more statistics than this, folks. The groups are clear and obvious. But if you want to go further, we go further. Find the underlying distribution of antimony in the bullets, and I will take a moment to discuss what that distribution is or what it can be approximated by. We try first the Gaussian or normal distribution following standard statistical procedures. We plot the 14 points. These are 14 background bullets that Gwynne analyzed with contributions from all 4 of the lots of manufacture. If there is a straight line, if the points fall on a straight line there on this normal probability diagram, the antimony is distributed normally. Gaussian-like in this. They don't fall on a straight line. We then move to the next nearest distribution, log normal distribution. Again, following standard procedures. We plot the logs here. On the probability plot log of antimony, you can see at the bottom, and we get a very good approximation to a straight line. So we can use the log normal distribution for further statistical approximations. Log normal distribution works because the points fall close to the straight line. Another important point, the fragments from the assassination fall on the straight part of the line. To go back a little bit, you see the first point and the last point are a little bit above the line. The actual fragments from the assassination fall on the straight part of the line. That gives us confidence. There they are. Here's where the two groups are. You see they're up around the 80%. They're up at the 80th percentile approximately, but that's fine as long as they're on the straight part of the line. Okay, now we have the distribution log normal. Now we can test the means, and to go to the bottom of this slide, you'll see when you run this through a simple statistical test. I use the commercial program Statistica for this. You get less than 1 part in 360 chance that the means are the same. Note, we get the same answer with the normal distribution, less than 1 part in 360, or 1 in 400 chance that the means are the same. Now we go into a little bit more statistics. A general linear model analysis from the Minitab statistical package. This is Larry's work. The nice thing about the general linear model is it assumes no underlying statistical distribution. The only thing it assumes is that the residuals are distributed normally. It has a group variable with an F statistic that corresponds to a probability of about 1 part in 1,000 to 1 part in 10,000 that the groups arose by chance. It didn't happen. Conclusion, the two groups are distinct. All 4 tests give the same answer. Now, we come to the heart of this, right? The huge significance of the distinctness of these groups. And I have a whole bunch of points I want to tick off for you. I'm sorry if I have to go through these a little bit quickly, but I want to give you the overview. I want to make sure we get everything in today. Number 1, the chemical data trace all recovered fragments to Oswald's rifle. Number 2, they prove that Oswald's rifle was fired that day, and I'm going to show you both those points on the next slide. That's the one we've seen already. Look at the two groups. In each group, we'll talk about point number 2 here, that the rifle was fired that day, because I think this is the only way to demonstrate it. Each of the groups has a large fragment in it that could have been thrown into the limousine or thrown onto the stretcher at Parkland or something like that. In the left group, it's the stretcher, CE399. In the right-hand group, it's the large fragment from the front seat, Q2 CE567. But it also has a little fragment from one of the men's bodies that was placed immediately into evidence. In the first group, it's the wrist fragment, Q9. In the second group, it's the fragments from JFK's brain. Okay. While you could have, in theory, and we're going to show that that couldn't happen, but in theory we'll grant you for now, you could have planted the large fragments. There's no possibility of planting those little fragments. Okay? This is the way you show that the rifle was fired that day. The way you show that all fragments are linked to the 2 bullets is obvious from these two groupings. 3, shows that no fragments or cartridge cases were planted. I will go into that in just a moment. Shows that there must have been a forward snap in the head. How do we know that? Because we know the fragments from the head trace to a shot from the depository, from the rear. So the head must have snapped forward. We can validate, it validates the forward speed calculations you get, shows that the big rearward lurch was not from a frontal hit because there was only 1 bullet that hit the head, and that was from the rear. Renders the locations of entrance and exit wounds in JFK's head irrelevant. This is an important point to go through because we can work around. The neutron activation analysis allows us to work around some of the difficult medical evidence. We have for the head a 3-point trajectory generated from the neutron activation. We know the bullet started in the depository on Oswald's rifle. We don't know whose finger was on the trigger. We know it started from that rifle. We know it passed through the head because it left fragments matching the front seat fragment, and then we know that it ended up in the front seat. It started behind him, it passed through his head, it came out and landed in the front seat. For purposes of finding out who did it, you don't need to know the details of where it ended, where it entered, and how it exited. We can go through a similar thing for the back wound. It takes a little longer, and if we have time at the end, I will come back to this. Renders the offset of holes in JFK's clothing moot. Same reasoning as from the previous one. Invalidates, and I will say and show in just a minute, invalidates all conspiracy theories with other shooters or planted bullets, and gives us the beginning of the best shooting scenario. Early miss, second shot passed through the two men's bodies around 222 to 224, and the third shot at 312 to 313. Brings Oswald much closer to the crime in toto. His rifle did it all. His prints on the rifle and boxes, his clipboard, his paper bag, his backyard photo, his flight from the depository, his killing of Oswald, his attempt to kill again in the Texas theater. In other words, the neutron activation shows that 2 bullets from Oswald's rifle account for everything that happened that day. Now, let me address some potential problems and answers. Ben, I'm not keeping track of the time. I've got lots? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, that means 15 University of Rhode Island time, sorry. Potential problems and answers. Okay, I say potential because none of them turn out to be real problems. Heterogeneity of antimony in the Mannlicher-Carcano bullets may potentially blend these groups or fuse them into one. 2, 14 samples not enough to establish a distribution. We've touched on that one already, but we'll come back to it. 3, can't distinguish distributions. 4, fragments might have been planted. 5, chance match of fragments from additional shooters or planted fragments. 6, incorrect metallurgical assumptions. And 7, it doesn't really prove anything. So I'm going to go through these rather quickly to give you the overview of the power of the neutron activation analysis. First, the heterogeneity of antimony in Mannlicher-Carcano bullet lead. Antimony is our prime tracer. It turns out that individual bullets and individual quarters of bullets have highly varying concentrations of antimony. And the question then arises, well, how can you use it to say anything about 2 bullets if there are such wide variations? And I prepared this slide to show you the scale of the variations. It's going to be followed by another summary slide, right? But look at the first part on the left here. Individual bullets, these are the 14 background bullets from Gwynn, and you can see the concentrations of antimony range in one piece from each of those bullets range from about 20 parts per million up to 1,200 parts per million. If you look at quarters of 3 test bullets that Gwynn ran, you will see that in the first bullet, the one in blue, 6001C, that the quarters clump pretty close together. But each of the other 2 bullets, 2A and 3A, have 3 fragments close together and one that varies by quite a bit. And these are quite large variations. Turns out to be about 20%, 24% average heterogeneity. Okay. The next one is a very important one. The FBI, in its wisdom, although I think it was just careful analytical practice at those days, ran replicates, multiple replicates, like 4 or 5 replicates typically on most of these samples. That gives us extremely valuable information of the variability of the fragments, antimony in these fragments, on the small scale. And you see they come very close together all of a sudden. Their average heterogeneity drops down from 24%. Now it's down to 5%. And that is almost like the fragments from the crime scene, which are, the 2 groups are average around 3%. And as seen from this one, it is almost like, on the far right, it is almost indistinguishable from analytical uncertainties of 2% to 3%. Okay? So we have a paradox on our hands. How can we have such tight groups like this and yet have such heterogeneous quarters of bullets? Why? Why are bullets heterogeneous in antimony but groups or fragments not? Okay? The answer lies in the FBI's subfragments. Mannlicher-Carcano bullet lead is homogeneous at the scale of subfragments. This implies that the groups were formed, the 2 groups from the evidence fragments, are formed on the scale of subfragments. Now, that's easy to show for the first group, the stretcher bullet and the fragment from Connolly's wrist, because they came from the same place. They come in the very end of the lead. Okay? For the head group, it's not quite so easy to show, but there is a good ballistic evidence, a good ballistic explanation for this provided by my colleague Larry Sturdivant. Follows from the way jacketed bullets break, and I'll be very brief about this story, but basically when a jacketed bullet hits a bone, whether it's on a slant or whether it's straight on, the nose begins to flatten, the bullet begins to bend sideways, internal pressure increases, the jacket ruptures, the lead is pulled taffy-like out, ruptures, and a spray of fine fragments is released from a very small portion of the lead. Here's a picture of a bullet that was fired from Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano, and you can see the distortion of the jacket on the left and of the lead core on the right. The point is that the spray of little fragments come from the single large break. Cores of Mannlicher Carcano bullets don't break into a gazillion fragments at these speeds. They break into 1 or 2 fragments. The break points release the lead the little lead fragments. When you go back and compare the tiny lead fragments with the core, you are comparing two things that came basically from the same place. Okay, are 14 samples enough to establish a distribution? We showed this already. Of course, there it is. Do you need to be able to distinguish different distributions? No. The major distributions are very similar except for their extremes. And I want to show you some stuff from the National Bureau of Standards here. It doesn't have to come from there. Here's some common symmetrical distributions. The normal distribution, the T, the power normal, the Tukey lambda, the Cauchy, and so on. They are, at least the first three of these things are very, very similar. Common asymmetric distributions, the log normal, the Weibel, the gamma, the power log normal, and the fatigue-like distribution are all very similar to one another. What you need to do is find a distribution that adequately represents the fragments. You don't have to tell which distribution it is because they're all the same in the middle. Okay? Were the fragments planted? Big question. We say no, that's impossible. Two reasons. The timeline was too restricted and the probabilities of this are too low. Okay, let's look at the timeline. There are three potential zones of time where fragments could be planted. Right? The first one is between the shooting and the FBI's spectrographic analysis that night. That leaves a few hours only. Lots of difficult things would have had to have happened in order to plant the fragments at this point. You can read these off, but let me just tick off a couple of them. Needed incredible knowledge and control by the conspirators. They would have had to anticipate the type of weapon, the number of shots, the number of location of hits, on and on and on. It's all but impossible to anticipate this complex scenario in advance. This brings to mind my colleague Gene Davidson's famous to-do lists. Okay? First, we have the conspirators' to-do list. Before the fact, get Oswald's rifle and camera, fake backyard photos, forge Oswald's writing on the back of backyard photo, hire Oswald lookalikes, send a rifle range gun shop, etc., etc. Anticipate all possible shooting scenarios, fire bullets into human body or equivalent, recover them, sneak gunman and rifle into Texas schoolbook depository, make sure Oswald has no alibi for the time of shooting. After, get Oswald out of depository to safety, plant stretcher bullet or switch with real pointed bullet, fake x-rays, autopsy photos, fake the Zapruder film. Oswald's to-do list is, number 1, get rifle, shoot Kennedy. Number 2, get pistol, shoot Tippit. You see the difference in difficulty here, folks. Okay? Now continue on the timeline. The other two parts of the timeline. First, between the emission spectroscopy and the FBI's neutron activation of May 64. There would have, this is unwarranted, there would have been no reason to cover up the extremely inconclusive results of the spectroscopy, and they were kept secret for years anyhow. What about between the two neutron activation analyses in 64 and 67? It didn't happen because Gwyn's data matches the FBI's. That leaves the only possible place back in the beginning that was impossible on its face. Conclusion, planning virtually impossible. probabilities of chance match. And this gets into, Larry has done something that amazes both of us here. There are two ways to estimate the probability of chance matches. Number one, two statistically independent approaches to this. Number one, from a continuous distribution that we saw before. Number two, from the general linear model on the FBI's data. I won't go through this in detail, but basically you use the continuous distribution to calculate the standard normal variance. If you consider Q1 and Q9, the stretcher fragment and the wrist fragment, you get that they are different by 1% of the area under the distribution, which means that if you allow variability on both sides, you get a maximum of 2% probability for the groups, and that's the highest for the planting. That's the highest probability you can get in any of this stuff. If you allow a shooter who didn't know or didn't care about the type of rifle or the type of ammunition, it drops down by a factor of something like 10 to 100, goes down to 1 part in 1,000 to 1 part in 10,000. If the cores are pure lead, or if they are hardened lead with 20,000 to 40,000 parts per million antimony, the probability of a chance match drops to 0. I see we're getting near the end of the time here. From the general linear model, you can get a very similar result. It turns out, and let me just jump ahead, it turns out that the probability of getting 5 chance matches is at best 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 100,000, and at a more reasonable value is 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 10 million, roughly 1 in a million chance that these groups arose. Probability of these groups arose by chance. If hardened lead cores are used, it drops to 0. Okay. Note, 2 independent have given the same one. I'm going to skip over these. I just showed these. Okay. Conclusion: all popular conspiracy theories are eliminated mathematically. This is the first time that we have been able to put a number, a quantitative number, on the reliability of a conspiracy theory, and they are at best 2% and they are at worst 0. Realistic conspiracy theories are down, that involve extra bullets or extra shooters, are down in the 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million range. It didn't happen. I think we're going to hear in the next talk about some metallurgical assumptions, but I just want to state that the new stuff that's coming out, and there was an article in yesterday's paper about FBI bullet analysis found to be flawed, but when you look at that article, it turns out to be very general. It's based on a leak of a report that is not yet out. It says nothing about neutron activation analysis, says nothing about the JFK case. It really doesn't apply. Let me close now by listing the conclusions, the important things that the neutron activation data proves. The stakes are very high here. If the neutron activation data is right, a lot of stuff held dear by the conspiracy community falls away. Here's what the neutron activation does. It shows that the fragments fall into 2 separate groups, the only grouping that makes physical sense. It shows that every fragment recovered came from Oswald's rifle. All the damage that day came from 2 bullets from his rifle. Oswald's rifle was actually fired that day. No fragments were planted. Conspiracy theories don't work. Validates forward head snap. Shows that it must have been a forward head snap. Shows that the rearward lurch could not have been from a frontal bullet. Shows that the throat wound was of exit, not entrance. Proves it is not necessary to know the exact placement of the entrance and exit wounds at JFK's head and body, and the same thing for the offset. The neutron activation is truly the queen of the physical evidence. Everything falls in place. The physical evidence is cemented into an impregnable wall. It remains highly unlikely that there's anything material left to be discovered. We are dealing, folks, in my opinion, with 40 years of failed speculation. It's enough. It is time to admit that there was no conspiracy and there never was any compelling evidence for it. The real story of the assassination: one misfit guy, a cheap but effective rifle, a good vantage point, and some luck. It's over. It was the product of chance, not of conspiracy. Thank you very much.